April 25th, 1945, Elbe River, Germany. Smoke rose like ghosts into the gray morning sky, curling over the shattered remnants of Torgau, a village that had seen too much war and mercy too little. From the west came the Americans, from the east the Soviets. And standing silently near the Elbe River was Private Thomas "Tom" Gallagher, a 23-year-old from a quiet Iowa farm, gripping his rifle like it might vanish if he let go. Tom hadn't joined the fight for glory. Back home, war stories were told in hushed tones, but this war was different. Hitler's armies had swept through nations like wildfire. Tom had enlisted because he couldn't sit idle while evil marched across borders. But as the mud clung to his boots and the acrid stench of smoke filled his lungs, he wasn't sure where righteousness ended and senseless killing began. His orders were clear: meet the Soviet forces at the Elbe, make contact, hold ground. It sounded simple, but war had a way of taking simple things and breaking them apart. Nothing was ever clean. Not the orders. Not the uniforms. Certainly not the deaths. Tom adjusted his helmet as he stepped closer to the river. A jagged bridge stretched across it in ruins, a grim monument to the days and nights of shelling that had turned villages into ashes. But across the water, on the opposite bank, movement caught his eye. Soviet soldiers emerged, cautious at first, then bolder. One waved a stained white cloth. Another raised a cigarette in what could only be a universal gesture of peace. They were ragged, dirty, young. Just like him. For a heartbeat, Tom froze. His finger hovered near the trigger. War had taught him reflexes, suspicion. But then the voice of Sergeant Muldoon broke the silence. "Hold fire, boys," the old Irishman growled. "They're not our enemy today." Muldoon had been in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy. He'd seen it all. If he said not to shoot, Tom trusted him. Cautiously, the Americans lowered their weapons. Slowly, like a truce written in gestures, both sides stepped forward. Tom and a few others waded into the shallows, while a group of Soviet troops mirrored them. There was tension unspoken, but also something new. Hope. They met near the middle, no handshake yet, just looks. Some of the Russians laughed. One of them pointed at Tom's helmet and grinned. Tom, unsure, smiled back. Language didn't matter. Not here. Not now. For the first time in months, Tom felt something lift from his chest. The burden didn't vanish, but it shifted. Here were men who, days ago, might have been strangers. Now, they were allies. Survivors of the same storm. He looked at the soldiers on the opposite shore. Just kids, many of them. Like him. They had probably lost friends, maybe family, maybe whole cities. And yet they were smiling. Not because the war was over, not yet, but because they had made it another day. Tom didn't know what came next. Peace wasn't guaranteed. But on that morning, on the banks of the Elbe, something changed. Enemies became allies. Fear gave way, if only briefly, to connection. He took a breath, deep, shaky, filled with smoke and spring air, and stepped further into the river. Maybe history would forget this moment. But he wouldn't. Tom's War Diary, April 25th, 1945. Met the Russians today. Shook hands across the Elbe. Strange men. Dirty uniforms, loud voices, gold teeth flashing. But they smiled. I think I smiled too. For a moment, the war stopped. Just for a moment. That moment stretched into the next day, when a joint camp was set up near the broken bridge. The Americans and Soviets, though separated by culture, language, and a long history of suspicion, found common ground. They shared what little they had: American chocolate, Russian cigarettes, laughter that felt like it had been buried under months of horror. The sound was strange, raw, unfamiliar. It had been a long time since anyone laughed freely. Among the Soviet troops, Tom noticed a young soldier who stood apart, not out of arrogance, but gentleness. His name was Yuri Antonov. He looked around Tom's age, maybe younger, and had a quietness that seemed almost out of place among the chaos of war. He didn't speak English, and Tom didn't speak Russian, but they managed to communicate through broken German, crude drawings in the dirt, and lots of pointing. Tom learned that Yuri had a sister back in Leningrad, a city scarred by one of the longest sieges in history. She was all he had left. Yuri kept a creased photograph of his family in his chest pocket and showed it to Tom one evening by the fire. His parents, long gone now. His sister, smiling in the background with a ribbon in her hair. Tom nodded solemnly. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photo of Murphy, his dog back home in Iowa. Yuri squinted at it, then burst into laughter. They couldn't explain the joke, but it didn't matter. They laughed. For a little while, they weren't soldiers, just two young men trying to make sense of a world that had lost its mind. Over the next few days, they sat side by side during quiet hours. Sometimes they traded food, sometimes stories neither fully understood. But they understood enough. Both had seen death. Both wanted to go home. And both, somehow, had found friendship across barbed wire and borders. April 28, 1945, 3 days later. The brief peace, as fragile as it was beautiful, ended in a blink. Just after dawn, shots rang out from the trees. Sharp cracks, unmistakable. German snipers, likely SS holdouts, had slipped through the forest undetected. Bullets ripped through the air. The camp erupted in chaos. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting in different languages, united now only by survival. Tom had been sitting near a broken cart when it happened. He saw Sergeant Muldoon fall first, a clean shot through the neck. The old Irishman didn't even scream. He just crumpled, blood blooming across his collar. A Russian corporal went down next, dragged away by his comrades, face pale and still. Tom's training kicked in. He grabbed Yuri by the arm and yanked him down behind the splintered wagon. Dirt and bark exploded around them as bullets struck the wood. "Stay down," Tom shouted, though he knew Yuri might not understand. But war had its own language, a brutal, universal one. They lay side by side in the mud, breath heaving, fingers on triggers. Tom peered through a crack in the wood and caught movement in the treeline. He aimed and fired, once, twice, unsure if he hit anything. Return fire came quickly, forcing him to duck back. Beside him, Yuri winced. His hand clutched his side. "Yuri?" Tom asked, eyes wide. Blood seeped between Yuri's fingers. No, damn it," Tom muttered, ripping off his jacket to press against the wound. "You're okay. You're gonna be fine." Yuri tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper. Russian words spilled out, soft, uncertain. Tom couldn't understand them, but he nodded anyway, blinking fast. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Yuri smiled faintly, like he'd heard what he needed. Then his hand fell still. The gunfire faded. But Tom didn't move. "Stay low," Tom shouted, even though he knew Yuri probably didn't understand the words. But war didn't need translation. It had its own brutal language: duck, run, shoot. Tom crouched behind the shattered wagon, his rifle trembling in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest like a drumbeat, loud enough to drown out the shouts and gunfire. He peeked out, catching movement in the treeline, shadows slipping between trees. He squeezed the trigger. Once. Twice. The recoil jolted through his shoulder, but he didn't know if he hit anything. He wasn't aiming anymore, just reacting. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the forest fell silent. The snipers had vanished. Tom stayed still, waiting, listening. But the only sound now was the moaning wind and the cries of the wounded. He turned to Yuri. Yuri was on his back, one hand pressed tightly to his side. Blood soaked through his uniform, staining it a deep, terrible red. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. No, Tom murmured, his voice cracking. He ripped off his jacket and pressed it hard against the wound. "You're going to be okay. It's not that bad. Just hang on." Yuri didn't speak. He looked up at Tom with wide, glassy eyes, not filled with fear, but with a quiet disbelief. Like he hadn't expected the bullet to find him. Like he thought he'd make it out. He tried to say something in Russian, but it came out as a whisper, barely a sound. Tom leaned in, trying to catch the words, but they slipped away before they could reach him. He didn't understand the language, but he could feel what Yuri meant. A goodbye. A memory. Maybe a prayer. Stay with me, Yuri, Tom said, his voice tight. Help's coming. Just hold on. But Yuri's hand, the one clutching Tom's sleeve, began to loosen. He gave a faint smile, the same one he'd given around the campfire just days before, laughing at a photo of a dog he'd never met. Then he closed his eyes. Tom stared at him, unmoving, his hands still pressed to the wound. Around them, the riverbank was silent again. Where laughter and peace had briefly bloomed, now only stillness remained. Bodies lay scattered across the dirt, the fragile bond between two armies shattered by a single volley of gunfire. But Tom didn't hear any of it. He sat beside his fallen friend, holding onto a silence that no rifle could ever break. Tom's War Diary, April 28, 1945. Yuri died today. My friend. My brother in another language. I didn't understand what he said in his final breath. I wish I did. I wish I could have told him that he mattered. That he wasn't just another uniform in the mud. That he left something behind in me. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war had ended. All across Europe, the celebrations erupted like fireworks after a long storm. In Paris, people danced in the streets. In London, champagne bottles were opened and drained. In Moscow, the bells rang for hours. Flags waved. Smiles returned to faces that had forgotten how. But for Private Thomas Gallagher, there was no cheering. No music. No champagne. Only quiet. He wandered alone to the banks of the Elbe River, the place where, just days ago, he had met Yuri, a boy with gentle eyes and a smile that could melt war-hardened silence. They had smoked there, drawn pictures in the dirt, laughed without understanding each other's words. Tom could still hear Yuri's laugh in the wind, as if the river remembered. He sat beneath the same half-burnt tree they had shared, now scarred by bullet holes and smoke. The grass had begun to grow again around it, timid and unsure, like everything else in Europe. He took out a small notebook and a pencil. But this time, he wasn't writing in his diary. He was writing a letter. Not to his parents. Not to the U.S. Army. Not even to his chaplain. This letter was for Anastasia Antonova, Yuri's sister. Tom had found a Russian translator among the officers, a man from Brooklyn who spoke enough Russian to help him shape the message. It wasn't perfect. The grammar was rough. The sentences stiff. But it didn't matter. The message was clear. The letter. Dear Anastasia, my name is Thomas Gallagher. I served in the U.S. Army and met your brother, Yuri, on the Elbe River. We were part of the first meeting between American and Soviet forces on April 25th. I want to tell you about Yuri because I believe someone should. Your brother was kind. In a world full of noise and fire, he was calm. We didn't speak the same language, but we still managed to talk, with drawings, with broken words, with laughter. He showed me a picture of your family. He said your name. He smiled when he did. I want you to know that in the short time I knew him, he made an impression on me that I will carry for the rest of my life. He was not just a soldier. He was a brother, a friend, a bridge between two men from opposite ends of the earth. Yuri died on April 28th during a surprise attack by German snipers. I was with him when it happened. I tried to help. I held his hand. I wish I had understood his last words. I wish he could have heard mine. He was not alone when he died. He was not forgotten. And he never will be. If you ever find yourself wondering what happened to him, please know he mattered. To me. To all of us. With respect, Private Thomas Gallagher. When Tom finished, he folded the paper slowly and slipped it into an envelope. He didn't know if it would reach her. He didn't know if the letter would be opened, or if the war had taken her too. But he had to try. It was all he had left to give. He looked out at the river. The water moved quietly, carrying pieces of ash, leaves, and perhaps memories. He whispered Yuri's name once, softly, and let the silence carry it. Then he stood, brushed the dirt from his pants, and walked back toward the camp. The war was over, but part of him would always remain at the Elbe, under that tree, beside a friend whose language he never spoke, but whose heart he had understood completely. The letter, May 8, 1945. To the sister of Yuri Antonov. My name is Thomas Gallagher, a soldier in the United States Army. I had the honor of knowing your brother, Yuri, during the final days of the war here in Germany. We met at the Elbe River, where Soviet and American troops first made contact. It was a historic moment, but for me, it became something far more personal. It was the beginning of a friendship I will never forget. Though Yuri and I didn't share a common language, that didn't stop us from connecting. We spoke with gestures, broken bits of German, and drawings in the dirt. But mostly, we spoke through laughter. We traded small things, cigarettes, chocolate, stories, and photographs. I showed him a picture of my dog. He showed me one of you and your family. He smiled every time he looked at that photo. It was clear you meant the world to him. You were his light in the darkness, the thing that kept him going when so much had been lost. Yuri was kind. He had a quiet strength, a calmness in his eyes that stood out in a place surrounded by chaos. In those brief days, he became more than just a fellow soldier. He became my friend, my brother in a language neither of us spoke. On April 28th, just 3 days after we met, our camp was attacked by German snipers. In the confusion, Yuri was shot. I tried everything I could to save him. I stayed by his side. I held his hand. He looked at me and smiled, not with fear, but with peace. His last moments were not filled with pain or panic. He was calm. I only wish I could have understood what he tried to say. I want you to know that he wasn't alone when he died. He wasn't forgotten. He was cared for and he was loved, even if only for a short while. I promised myself I would find a way to tell you this. That your brother mattered. That his life and his sacrifice meant something. This letter may never reach you. The world is still broken in many ways. But if by chance it does, I hope it brings you even the smallest comfort to know that your brother died with honor, with dignity, and with someone who cared for him by his side. May peace and healing find you in time. With deepest sympathy and respect. 20 years later, Iowa, 1965. The Iowa farm was quiet, much like Tom himself. Now in his 40s, he carried the war in the lines on his face and the silence in his eyes. He never spoke of those days, never married. But by his bedside sat a small wooden box. Inside it, a faded photo of a Russian family, a single dog tag, and a carefully folded letter in Cyrillic, sent in 1950, 5 years after Tom had written to Yuri's sister. He had kept it ever since. Some memories, he knew, were not meant to fade. Epilogue: The Elbe Reunion, 1985. Veterans gathered on the banks of the Elbe again. Americans and Russians. Old men now, wrinkled, bent, but standing. Tom came alone. He found the spot, the tree, or what was left of it. He placed a small cross in the ground, carved from Iowa oak. On it were the words, "To Yuri, my brother across the river." As he stood there, another old man approached. He wore Soviet medals. He looked at the cross, then at Tom. "You, Tom?" the man asked, heavily accented. Tom nodded. The man smiled, reached into his coat, and pulled out a photo. It was Tom and Yuri sitting by the fire, laughing. A snapshot someone had taken all those years ago. "I, friend of Yuri," the man said. "Anastasia, she say to find you. She died. But she say, if you meet Tom, give him this." Tom took the photo with trembling hands. The two men sat together in silence, overlooking the river. Not as soldiers. Not as enemies. As brothers. Translated letter from Leningrad. Dear Thomas, thank you. I cried when I read your letter. Yuri always talked about how he would make friends across the world. You gave him that gift. I am sorry you had to see him die. But I thank you for being with him. You were his brother. If you ever come to Leningrad, there will always be a place for you in our home. With love, Anastasia Antonova.